Some of you might know that in October, Resist held its first festival of resistance in Nottingham, where workshops were held on the subject of how we could resist the various ways that the ruling class tried to subdue our society. The original intention was for people who weren't able to physically attend to be able to remote into the different workshops. Unfortunately, the organisers were significantly let down by the owner of the conference centre that they were using. And so this became impossible to do. So I made a promise at that time that what I would try to do is to make a video of my own contribution to the workshop that I delivered alongside the inspirational Jackie Walker on the subject of why we should resist the witch hunt. And with everything that's going on at the moment, again, we see another escalation of the witch hunt in recent weeks. So it just seems like a really good time to make this video. So I'm going to start there with the first slide. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this scene. It's an image that represents a scene from the book and play The Crucible, a time of mass hysteria where anyone slightly different or who anyone actually held a grudge against could find themselves accused with a crime of being a witch or in the service of the devil, an accusation that it became impossible to defend yourself against. And is this not the same as our generation's McCarthyism? Is this not what McCarthyism of our time with the Israel lobby is all about? That the moment somebody uses the A word against you, you are immediately considered guilty and unable to make a defence for yourself. So it seems like a good thing to have a little think about what the witch hunt is actually about. Some of these things may seem fairly obvious, but it's just good for us to sort of consider these different elements and which parties and what the reasons are for the various parties. So if we consider the Israel lobby, well, that's fairly obvious. It's to protect the settler colonialist states that they either benefit from or support because it aligns with their racist imperialist values and agenda. And also to prevent external pressure being applied to the state in order to make it comply with international law and to end its apartheid against the indigenous Palestinian people. But what about our governments here in the West and US in the West? Well, again, it's because the Israeli state, if we're honest, aligns also with their own imperialistic agenda and that battle to maintain hegemony in the area and control of the resources. What about mainstream media? Well, if we think about it, we know that most of our media is owned obviously by the 1%, by the billionaire class. So when it comes down to it, their role, the mainstream media, as they put out their message and as they share their narrative, is to protect the 1%, to protect that status quo, to protect the ruling classes and of course their financial interests. But I think as we talk about the status quo, it's really important for us to understand what that means for the Palestinian people. I think it is so very important that when we talk about the need to resist the witch hunt, that we put the Palestinians at the centre of that. Now, obviously, I don't have time to go through all the various things that Palestinians are facing as they suffer Israeli apartheid. And I don't have time, obviously, to share all my experiences, the things I witnessed and the things that happened as I served as a human rights monitor in Hebron in 2018. So what I want to do now is just to show a really short video. It's from a few years ago that focuses on the subject of Palestinian child prisoners. It starts with a case of the daughter of a friend of mine, Ahed Tamimi, who courageously slapped an Israeli soldier who was trying to enter her home after having just shot her cousin in the head with a rubber-coated steel bullet that required him to undergo neurosurgery. no matter how many times I watch that video, I still find it incredibly difficult video to watch, to consider what it is that Palestinians are facing, but particularly children. So I'd really encourage people to look up Palestinian child prisoners, because there's some brilliant resources online that explains what living under apartheid means for the Palestinians and the children especially. So it seems like a good time now, after having watched that, to think about what is it that gets in the way of people resisting? What is it that's preventing them? And it'd be good for you to maybe just spend a little bit of time just having a think about that. So what I want to do is go through now the reasons why I think people fail to resist or are reluctant to resist. And obviously one of the most obvious ones probably is fear of reputational damage and loss of a job. And of course, this is legitimate. If we think about this in the current context of the current climate, alongside many others, you no doubt know about the case of David Miller, an academic at Bristol University. We'll talk about him in a little bit. And most recently, just within the last week, the case of Shahed Abu Salama being suspended from Sheffield University. Like I said, we will talk about them shortly, so I won't sort of focus too much on that. But it's understandable that people are fearful, because we know that people have been trolled, people's works have been contacted. So this is a legitimate and understandable thing. The other issue, I think, is a lack of understanding of what anti-Semitism is and isn't. And again, that's really understandable, because this is not what the conflation has been about, to muddy the waters so that you don't, people, the general public, don't understand the difference between Judaism, whether as a religion or as an ethnic identity, and the political ideology of Zionism. And this has not been helped by the optics left. Another thing I would say is a lack of knowledge on the subject of Palestine and Israel. Again, the waters have been muddied, so many people don't understand the settler colonialist roots of the modern state of Israel, which started long before 1967 and 1948. The other thing I would say is, I think the unhelpful sources for when people are looking at the subject to try and understand what the situation is. We know that every single mainstream media resource has been horrendous, but this also includes, I suppose, those most well known to be, or considered to be, on the left. So resources such as The Guardian, if we think of people like Owen Jones, but also Novara Media, have done a terrible job in explaining what the situation is about, and sometimes holding really unhelpful positions that aren't informed actually by fact and the reality of what the apartheid means in terms of on the grounds for Palestinians, but also not properly explaining the difference between, as I said before, Judaism and Zionism. And this really hasn't helped. And so I think this ignorance has resulted in people, again, being confused and being hesitant to take a stand against the witch hunt. And the other thing, and I think this is a really important one, is lack of solidarity. If you think you're going to be left alone or hung out to dry, this is going to impact how people feel about resisting the witch hunt. We know that solidarity is everything. Movement will never succeed without solidarity. And I think that has been really difficult when, again, people that we would have considered as allies, haven't called out the dishonesty of this witch hunt. And I think we need to be honest when we think about this, about how disappointing the left PLP have been, the Socialist Campaign Group. I often try and think about what was it that led to them, not really taking a stand against the witch hunt. And it's difficult to know whether it's just weakness or whether it's because they are woefully ignorant themselves on the subject. And when we think about this, it's important for us again to be honest and acknowledge that the witch hunt didn't start, although we know it's escalated under Keir Starmer, and we're in the ridiculous situation now where Jews are being disproportionately expelled from the Labour Party. It's important for us, although we recognise that fact and how hideous it's become. I mean, we're seeing a full-on purge, that this actually started when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. And I know that that's hard for some people to acknowledge and to consider, but this is a fact. We know that it was under Jenny Formby that veteran anti-racists began to start being expelled or suspended from the party for standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people, including our Jewish friends and comrades. So I think it's important now to consider what happens if we don't resist. What does that mean? And I think that for Palestinians, it's fairly obvious. We know that they will be forced to endure the very worst of settler colonialism and apartheid and all that brings. And I put there on the slide from when it was in Nottingham, the likely escalation of the Nakba, which of course we know has never ceased. It's continued since it first started in 48. But we're witnessing this at the moment as we look at what's happening in East Jerusalem. The other thing, and I think it's a really important one for us to think about, whether you're interested in Palestine and Israel or not, is the very dangerous precedents that it sets. Because if we allow Palestinians to be silenced, if we allow the Palestinian issue to be removed from public discourse, well, it's going to be open season for any special interest group, because they will use the same tactics in order, again, to remove from public discourse any cause or issue that challenges the status quo. And I think when we think about that, it's good to think about some of the rhetoric that Modi has been using when looking at sort of Hindu nationalism within India. They've actually brought out Israel as they've looked at what's happening with Israel and are using very similar tactics and language that Israel has as it tries to shut down the Palestinian issue. And alongside that, of course, there's the undermining or continue of the undermining of our freedom of speech and our very democracy. If we're unsure about that, we just need to look at the messages that were put out during the last election in 2019. And that's really frightening that, when a lobby group and special interest groups are able to have such influence over how people are informed about the situation, about how, I suppose, really swaying the decisions when people are going out to vote. And I think the other thing that I would say is that it undermines the moral fabric of our movement. If we allow ourselves, because, we accept that this is a taboo subject, if we allow ourselves to stay silent as the Palestinians are suffering in the way that we are, then how can we call ourselves true internationalists? How can we say that we hold the values as enshrined in international law? So I think that that's a really important thing to understand, that actually, and I quite often say this, the true values that somebody holds once it becomes difficult to hold those values. So I think it's really important we bear that in mind. And actually, when I was serving in Hebron, one of the roles that I had to undertake was to take delegations of MPs across the parties on tours around Hebron. And one of the things that I said to Caroline Feldman, a Tory MP, who interestingly actually wrote a blog upon her return from visiting Palestine on the subject. And I said to her that we need to understand, whether you're interested in Israel or Palestine or not, there is a real danger for all of us when we allow international law to become irrelevant, when we allow international law to be diluted, because what it enables is the acceptance of new norms. And I would say that this is what we're seeing at the moment with things like the policing bill, the nationality and borders bill, the covert human intelligence sources bill. I would say, these are laws and legislation that never would have been possible even 10 years ago. So I would say this is an indicator that the chickens are coming home to roost. So after we've kind of sort of considered this, it seems like a good idea to think about, as we reflect on why and resistance is so important, to think about, well, okay, so how are we going to build our resistance? And I think first and foremost, again, this is looking at the antidotes to the things we looked at in the earlier slide about what gets in the way. And one of those is we don't give in to fear. I think that is incredibly important. You've just watched a video on what it is that Palestinian children are facing, and hopefully that kind of gives us a little bit of perspective on the subject. We know obviously there are people that have lost their jobs. There are people who've suffered huge reputational damage. But actually, for most of us as ordinary people, we need to be honest. And, it's about trolling, it's about name calling. And name calling isn't nice. None of us like to be called names or to be accused of things that we haven't done. But I think it's important to remember that as long as we know we're not anti-Semites, that we really should disregard. I mean, the great thing about social media is for the most part, you can block people. So I do encourage people to use the block button. But to understand and fully appreciate that labels only have the power that we give to them. And actually, I would say when people accuse us of anti-Semitism, we don't cower, we double down. We remind ourselves that it is us that are on the right side of history. The second box there highlights another thought I have. Where it's viable, I do think it's appropriate for us to use the legal mechanisms that are available to us. At the moment, we'll talk again in a minute about David Miller, but there is a campaign there. We know that we've got the Left Fighting Fund. We know that there's other individuals that are challenging the accusations that have been made in the legal arena. And I think that as our circumstances allow, it's wholly appropriate for us to support these actions, because we know, again, that sets a positive precedent. If we go into the legal system and we're able, of course, we know it's stacked against us, but there are wins that happen. And when we win in those arenas, what it does is support us as a whole movement, because all of these things, as we know, are connected. The other thing is for us that are obviously union members, is we demand our unions support us, that they also make that stand against the witch hunt and stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, but also those who have been targeted. And I think sometimes the unions have been very, very poor on this, but we need to remind the unions that their role is to serve us as their union members and not to serve other interest groups. And the other thing I talked before, didn't I, about how this conflation of of Judaism and Zionism has caused real issue and resulted in misunderstanding what anti-Semitism is and isn't. So I think it's really important for us to educate ourselves on that subject. Including tropes, because I think that we can't ignore the fact that tropes do exist and they are horrendous. I've had to go on my own journey of understanding that area simply out of ignorance, so that's important. And a fantastic resource for that is Jewish Voice for Labour, who put a wealth of resources online for people to have a look at and make sure that they're fully informed on the subject. Next thing, I think, as I said before, part of the problem as well is a lack of understanding of the settler colonialist roots of the modern Israel project. So I think it's important and appropriate that we educate ourselves on the subject of Palestine and Israel from trusted, reliable sources. I've listed there Ilan Pappé, who's an incredible Israeli academic who's written a number of books on the subject, and I think he's one of the best sources that you can go to if you want to have an understanding of the journey, in the last sort of 1500 years to where we are now. I think that's really important. But you've got other resources such as Electronic Intifada and Mondevice, and Zokrot are also good. They're an Israeli group, NGO, that talk a lot about the Nakba. They're one of the groups that do acknowledge the Nakba, and they have some fantastic resources on there. I haven't put it on there, but another one that's incredibly good is Visualizing Palestine. And as I said before, solidarity is fundamental for us as a movement. It's the thing that allows us, enables the chance for us to win this fight, to win this struggle. So I think it's important that we give solidarity each and every time an individual needs it. And also, we connect with movements that we know have a history of giving solidarity. Movements like Black Lives Matter, as we know, have been very vocal and supportive, but there are others. And I think, I can't underscore enough how important solidarity is in terms of enabling us to move forwards in a way that supports us all. So I've spoken a little bit there about how the antidote to all the things that stop us, prevent people from standing in solidarity with Palestinian people and resisting that witch hunt. So I thought it'd be appropriate for us now to have a little look at some of the victims and resistors. And also to think about those who've become victims, how they've responded to the attacks against them. So there in that picture I mentioned before, we have Shahed Abu Salama, and I do apologise, Shahed, if I haven't pronounced your name correctly. But Shahed is a Palestinian graduate student. She's actually originally a refugee from Gaza, who, as I said, in the last week has been suspended from Sheffield University following a relentless campaign by the Israel lobby. And you can find out more about Shahed, and there's a campaign running at the moment. I really encourage people to support Shahed. If you go onto Twitter, you can easily find her, but the hashtag is in support of Shahed. And I think that is incredibly important to do that. So she's probably one of the most currently high profile victims.
I wanted to make a special point of saying that the university statement given the end of last week says that they had commissioned a QC who had concluded that none of my comments broke the law, that my comments were lawful. And that's true. The report did say that. But the report also said, and this is important, and I wanted the university to make this plain, and they haven't. The report also said explicitly that my comments were not anti-Semitic. They did not engage or exceed the Equality Act of 2010. And that's been missing in much of the commentary that there has been. I have seen some headlines which said that I have been sacked for anti-Semitism, which is untrue, which is defamatory. And we've had some of those headlines changed already. Hopefully, if there's more, we'll have them changed too. But also, it's been said that I've been sacked after complaints about anti-Semitism had been made. Well, that in itself is misleading because I was found not guilty of those complaints. And of course, that's something which the people who've been campaigning against me are unsurprisingly reluctant to admit. So that's been a really very serious assault on my reputation. As many people will know, I'm a lifelong anti-racist. There is not a shred of evidence in any comma, phrase, or sentence I have ever said that any of my comments have ever been anti-Semitic. I'm very well aware of the difference between the Jews as a people and Zionism as a political ideology. These things are different. Many Jews are not Zionists, as you say, and indeed, many Zionists are not Jews, as everyone points out, with the Christian Zionists, etc., etc. So the idea that to criticize Zionism as a political ideology, or to criticize the actions or indeed the foundation of the state of Israel is political commentary. It's not to do with hating Jews. It's got nothing at all to do with hating Jews. And that's something which people need to recognize.
I just showed the video there, a clip from David Miller, Professor David Miller's interview with Loki, which I think is incredibly important. So as I sort of referenced him before, David Miller lost his job as a lecturer at Bristol University following a relentless campaign by the Israel lobby against him. And despite having had 2 investigations, one of the QC that highlighted or concluded that he hadn't stated anything that was anti-Semitic and anything actually that should have warranted an investigation, he lost his job anyway. And it's really disappointing, actually, when you look at some of the people that came out in support of the Israel lobby at this time. We had Green MP Caroline Lucas signing a disgraceful letter calling for David to lose his job. And also there was support from Rivka Brown of Novara Media, so incredibly disappointing. And I had the privilege of meeting David, Professor David Miller, in Nottingham, and he's such a lovely guy. And when you look into the work that he's done, which is so incredibly important, I mean, these are frightening times when people, when in the academic world, people are losing their job for stating proven facts, for stating stuff that can be very, very clearly evidenced. So we've got some other individuals here. I'm sure you'll recognise some of these faces. We have Jackie Walker on the left there, and we have some faces there. I'm sure you recognise Paddy O'Keefe and Leah Levane of Jewish Voice for Labour, Chris Williamson, Greg Hadfield, and again Jackie. So I'll talk a little bit about where they are, but I thought it'd be good to think about going back to, you know, as I said, victims and resistors. Although these individuals have all been victims, I think it's important to remember that when they were targeted, they didn't bow out, they didn't cower, but rather they've doubled down. I said it before, is one of the things we need to do. They have actually increased their fight. And this is what resistance is. So if we think of Jackie Walker, obviously you'll see the witch hunt there. We know that she supported the creation of a documentary that focuses mainly on her case, but what was happening, the context at that time, which is brilliant. But also the other thing she did was she put together a one-woman play called The Lynching and went on a tour around the UK to explain the circumstances of her expulsion from the Labour Party, but also told the story of her mother, who was also a victim of a different witch hunt of McCarthyism in the 50s. And in that second picture, I told you all the individuals there, but that was a fantastic event during the Labour conference towards the end of last year. In the autumn of last year, there were counter events being held, which was fantastic. And one of them was the Resist event. And they had different speakers talking on different subjects throughout the weekend. But it concluded with a performance of Not the Ford Inquiry 2, which was absolutely fantastic, where victims of the witch hunt got up on stage and they were in front of 2 panels. One was Paddy O'Keefe playing for the Labour side, and we had Ken Loach and Graham Bash on the other side. And each individual came and shared their actual real experiences and the communication they had from Labour's compliance unit, which was brilliant. And actually, you can watch that online if you go to YouTube and type in "Not the Ford Inquiry 2" and it's the Roman numerals. You can watch that fantastic play. And here's some other examples here of how people have responded. So on the top right there, you've got actually another scene from Not the Ford Inquiry, somebody giving their testimony at that time. You have in the bottom right there, fantastic book by Lee Garrett, mainly focusing on the subject of Chris Williamson, but more widely the witch hunts generally and what was happening. But different sort of forms of resistance. You've got obviously a petition went out, David Miller, and actually if you look up David Miller on Twitter, there is still ways that you can continue to support him because this obviously hasn't been resolved as yet. Simon Magin on Twitter put a fantastic resource together, highlighting all the different sort of smears that we made against Jeremy Corbyn and against individuals, and just highlights how each one is nonsense, providing evidence. And actually, I would say that, and also Lee Garrett's book, provide fantastic references that really evidence the fact that this is an orchestrated, disingenuous campaign against veteran anti-racists. And there's a picture of me there. I think one of the things that I thought about as I watched the witch hunt unfold, and I have been targeted myself. I did write a Medium article on a subject. It was about how you could support the Jewish community without being Palestinian. But in it, I talk about the different ways that I have been targeted. And although thankfully at this moment I have been successful in keeping my job, that doesn't mean that things don't continue. But what I wanted to do is to show, or I guess I thought about, what could I do as an ordinary person to respond to the witch hunt? How could I stand in solidarity with the victims, especially being here quite isolated in Channel Islands? So what I did was I made a public referral to myself, to Labour's compliance unit for anti-Semitism, basically calling it out for what it was. And I was really privileged to have them on device who published that for me. And interestingly, despite my having referred myself in all the various ways that you can online, sending registered letters and all the rest of it, and obviously having these very publicly printed referral, I was never suspended. And actually, on the back of my self-referral, Israeli academic Chaim Breshev did similarly, and he was also in the same situation. So I suppose as we're coming towards the end of this presentation, I think, again, what I would say is, let's always keep in mind what it is that the Palestinians are facing. Let's get a little bit of perspective and what it means to them if we don't resist. And if that isn't such a huge concern to us, which hopefully it is, but remember the things that I spoke about before, about how it undermines our democracy, how it undermines our freedom of speech. And I'm going to read something out, I hope you don't mind, directly from my notes from when I was in Nottingham, because I want to make sure that I get this right. And it was something I said right at the end of my presentation, being mindful of who might be in the audience. So here it goes. We know that there will no doubt be members or supporters of the lobby that will watch this video and seek to disingenuously reframe what I am saying now, and those who support me, in order to cast us as anti-Semites. And I'm going to say to them now, we will not cower to bullies who seek to silence us as we stand in solidarity with the Palestinians as they suffer apartheid, as they suffer ethnic cleansing, as they suffer incremental genocide. And I think it's really important, comrades, we remember this is what they're facing. It's not nice for us to be targeted. It's not nice for us to be called names, to be accused of things that we are not guilty of. But it's good for us to remember that Palestinians are facing bombs, they're facing guns, they're facing the attempted erasure of them, their community, their culture, and their history from the region. And I say to the Israel lobby, the racism and shame is yours as you support and enable a state guilty of crimes against humanity. So I will repeat, as I have stated before, history is on our side. Morality is on our side. International law is on our side. You will continue with your witch hunt, but we will not succumb to it, because the tide is turning. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that fact too, that people are beginning to find out the reality of life on the ground for Palestinians. And I think that those with a functioning moral compass who are coming to understand what is happening are joining us, are standing with us in solidarity. So the days of Israeli apartheid are numbered, and so is the influence of the Israel lobby. They will not be able to continue to claim victimhood. There is little more shameful than trying to connect the Jewish community, who has such a rich history of standing with the oppressed and not the oppressor, to an ideology of white supremacy, which actually is what Zionism is. And I'm going to add this to the optics left, to the Owen Joneses, the Rivka Browns, the Michael Walkers, and others who have enabled this witch hunt and arrogantly tried to set the parameters of debate on this subject. You have been weighed and found wanting. You have proved yourself not to be allies, but to be enablers of this crime against humanity. And as I reiterate what I said in Nottingham to people there, I want to add something else in a light of Rivka Brown's recent disgusting tweet aimed at Asa Winstanley, who correctly called out Rivka on enabling the demonization of good people, including Chris Williamson, who Rivka shamefully referred to as a Jew baiter, and also David Miller. Firstly, Asa had never accused Rivka of being part of the Israel lobby, but rather what he had correctly highlighted was that she had been an enabler of the witch hunt, which the evidence proves that she does. And I would ask anyone who's concerned about that, ask Asa for that evidence. It's very, very easy to find out, to find online. But I just want to publicly state my solidarity with Asa, who, as we know, is an incredible investigative journalist with Electronic Intifada. But I want to say something else, and this is to Rivka. How shameful that you would intimate that Asa had sexually harassed you. Not only does this trivialize victims of true harassment, but it also demeans those victims. But in addition to that, Rivka, it demeans you. And I think that I really was horrified when I saw those tweets going out just recently on Twitter from Rivka. Anyway, what I want to do now, finally, as we come to the end of this presentation, is I want to finish on a quote there. So whenever I find myself feeling perhaps a little less brave, when I find myself tiring, as we all feel that we do in this struggle, because it is, it certainly feels more uphill at the moment for me. I don't know about you, than it has in recent years, because so many things seem to be happening at this time that aren't positive. It's not a great time. But what I do is, whenever I feel like I don't have much energy, when I feel like I am losing the will, is I turn to a source of great inspiration for me, the brave and beautiful soul that was Sophie Scholl, an anti-fascist in Germany during the Nazi era. If you want to find out more about her, look up Sophie Scholl and the White Rose movement. Just a few months before her 22nd birthday in Nazi Germany, she was executed by the Nazis. She was beheaded for having created a group that was countering the fascist narrative. And on the day just before she was taken out to be executed, these were her final words, and I think they're so incredibly beautiful. She said, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day and I have to go, but what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Now, hopefully, most of us will never have to pay the ultimate price for us. But I think it's really important for us to look to those who've walked this path before us, to stand on their shoulders, recognizing, I think quite often we have a tendency to put people on pedestals and to think that they are superheroes that had some special power, but they didn't. They were just ordinary humans like us. The difference was their conviction, their passion, their absolute commitment to their humanity, to their values, for standing up what is right. So what I would say, as those who stood before us, it is our turn, friends and comrades, to be brave. It is our turn to resist. It is our turn to take our gloves off and to fight back and to understand what happens if we don't resist. It is our turn to resist that witch hunt. Thank you.